When we talk about the past of civilization, we need to remember all the great things that many cultures did to get us to this point. But Western history often says that the Greeks and Romans were the first people to build civilizations. But what if I told you that the roots of society, math, learning, and even people themselves go back much further to Africa? For hundreds of years, people have been blind to and confused by this secret truth. The African past has been called the Cradle of Humanity because it has been so important to both its own and Europe's futures. In this search for the hidden truth, we will go from the beginning of time to the time when African and European societies were linked. We will learn about how Africa helped shape the culture and civilization of Europe, the Cradle of Humankind. The idea that Africa is the birthplace of humans is based on the study of fossilized hominids, which is called paleoanthropology. Lucy, an Australopithecus afarensis fossil found in Ethiopia, is the most well-known of these finds. Lucy was alive about 3.2 million years ago, which makes her one of the oldest fossils of a humanoid ever found. These findings show that Africa is where people first came from and where our species began. It is important to know that the Cradle of Humankind is not a single spot. Instead, it is a large area that includes parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa today. This area has given us a lot of information about our oldest ancestors, showing how our species changed over time from the hominids that lived in the African savannas. Egypt is a good place to start when telling the story of African culture. People all over the world know about ancient Egypt and its pyramids, pharaohs, and advanced buildings. Egypt is only one part of the story, though. A number of other powerful and important civilizations existed in Africa before the ones in Europe. Ancient Egypt. There's a good reason why ancient Egypt is one of the most well-known African civilizations. People started living together along the banks of the Nile River, which provided food, transportation, and good land for farming. The ancient Egyptians were able to build a sophisticated and advanced society because they lived close to the Nile. People around the world know the Egyptians for their impressive construction. The pyramids are among the most famous buildings in history. Building these pyramids took a huge amount of work from a lot of people who knew a lot about math, engineering, and science. The fact that the pyramids were perfectly lined up with stars and planets, like the Great Pyramid being lined up with the North Star, shows that the builders knew a lot about astronomy. The ancient Egyptians not only built amazing buildings, but they also came up with a very advanced way to write called hieroglyphics. Inscriptions on monuments, religious books, and government records all used these complicated scripts and symbols. The Egyptians were very good at keeping records and using words, as shown by hieroglyphics. The Egyptians also made great progress in health. Medical papyri describe a wide range of illnesses and their treatments. They knew a lot about advanced surgery, dentists, and even different herbs and substances that could be used for medicine. Nubia, Kush. The kingdom of Kush, which was also called Nubia, was a major neighboring society. It was located to the south of Egypt. Nubia was connected to Egypt by the Nile River, which was important for trade, farming, and cultural exchange. From about 2500 BCE to 350 CE, the kingdom of Kush did very well. Meroitic, the Nubians' own script, is still not fully understood, which is an interesting part of their society. Even though not a lot is known about this script, it is clear that it was used for writing holy texts and other things. This shows how deep and complicated Nubian society was. Nubia also built amazing pyramids like the ones in Egypt. These buildings show how good they were at architecture and how connected they were to Egypt culturally. Compared to the Egyptian pyramids, the Nubian pyramids, especially those in the Kingdom of Meroe, have a different shape that shows off their own style. In addition, Nubian art and culture had a big effect on Egyptian society. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty ruled Egypt and changed the art and society of Egypt. This time of cultural exchange makes the point that African cultures are linked even more. Axum. The culture of Axum, which is now in Ethiopia, was very important in ancient Africa. Around the 4th century BCE, it began to form. It is best known for making trade and cultural exchange easier in the Red Sea and Mediterranean areas. One interesting thing about the Axum society was how it set up trade networks. The Axumites were very important in making the link between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. This put them at the center of the exchange of things and ideas around the world. They did business with places as far away as India and the Mediterranean, and through trade, they got very rich. People from that time also built amazing obelisks, some of which are now among the largest in the world. The fact that these buildings were made from single blocks of stone and were carved in such a detailed way shows how skilled the Axumites were at engineering. The obelisks, which were often decorated with elaborate carvings, were used for many religious and cultural reasons. The Axumite writing system, called Ge'ez, is another interesting thing about their culture. This script was used for writing religious books and signs, especially in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where it is used for holy writing and services. Ge'ez is still used today. Carthage. The Phoenicians built Carthage, which is now in Tunisia. It was a powerful maritime society. It's important to remember that Carthage was an important part of the Old World long before its famous wars with Rome, especially the Punic Wars. Carthage was great at making ships and finding its way around. The progress they made in this area had a big impact on how trade grew in the Mediterranean. Carthaginian ships sailed all around the Mediterranean and beyond, making trade and cultural links with places far away. The Carthaginians were known for being very good at building ships. They were the first people to make trireme boats. The city of Carthage had an impact on the whole Mediterranean, and their trading operations brought new goods and ideas to the city. They did business with places as far away as North Africa, Sicily, and Spain. Carthage was very open to other cultures and ideas because it was a cosmopolitan city. Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe is in the southeast of Africa. It became famous between the 11th and 15th centuries. The amazing stone architecture of this society shows how skilled the people who lived there were at building and engineering. The Great Enclosure, which is one of the most famous buildings in Great Zimbabwe, shows how good the people were at building with dry stone. They were very good at engineering because they were able to fit huge stone blocks together with great accuracy without using glue. Many scientists disagree on what Great Zimbabwe was used for, but it is thought to have been a place of worship or government. As part of its society, Great Zimbabwe had complex trade networks that connected the area to trade routes in the Indian Ocean. This made it easier for people to trade things and ideas, which connected African civilizations to the rest of the world even more. One important theme is how these African cultures are linked to each other. They grew and changed on their own, but they also traded, shared cultures, and even fought with each other. The Trans-Saharan trade lines and other trade routes that went across Africa made it easier for people to share goods and information. Africa is not the only place where people are linked in this way. In addition, these African societies had a big impact on the bigger story of human history. The trade routes that went from Africa to places like the Mediterranean, India, and other places also helped people and things move around the world. These African societies were hubs for trade, art, and education. Before the Greco-Roman civilization took off in Europe, they were already making their own ways to rule, worship, and learn. It is important to understand how these African societies were linked, and how they shaped the story of Africa and, by extension, Europe. The Trans-Saharan trade routes. Trade was an important part of African history, and it also had big effects on Europe. People from North and West Africa could share goods, ideas, and technologies with each other through the Trans-Saharan trade routes. This trade had a big impact on Europe's future, and Africa was an important part of these deals. Camels, which were called ships of the desert, were necessary to get through the dry Sahara. A camel caravan would carry things like gold, salt, textiles, and valuable metals. People really wanted to get to the salt mines in the Sahara because they were so important for keeping food fresh and keeping people alive. West African societies like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai grew stronger thanks to the trade that went across the Sahara. Europe, on the other hand, gained a lot from this trade. African gold in particular was a major source of money for the Renaissance and the discovery of the New World. It gave Europe the money to send on journeys, support artists and scholars, and eventually pay for Christopher Columbus's trips on which he looked for a way to get to Asia from the West, but instead found the Americas. The rich trade routes across sub-Saharan Africa gave Europe the money it needed to start becoming the global powerhouse it is today. Europeans learned a lot from Africa. There was more than just trading goods across the Sahara. People also shared their knowledge. It was during this time that a lot of smart people came to Europe from Africa. North African scholars and thinkers brought with them scientific findings, philosophical ideas, and old knowledge that had been passed down and built upon for hundreds of years. How it affected the Renaissance. The spread of information from Africa and other parts of the Islamic world made the European Renaissance possible in a big way. During this time, translations and new interpretations of old works led to a revival of classical learning. This was a turning point in European history. People became interested in classical study, humanism, and the arts all over again during the Renaissance. A big part of this culture revival was studying texts from ancient Greece and Rome. Western scholars were able to use these important sources with the help of translations and commentaries written by Islamic and Andalusian experts. Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine and other African and Islamic contributions to medicine and science, along with progress in mathematics, set the stage for the scientific progress of the Renaissance. European thinkers built on this information, which led to big steps forward in many science fields. During this time, people from different cultures met and shared their ideas, which made European society better. It encouraged different kinds of people to live together, sparked intellectual growth, and helped Europe become more globally connected. Africa and the Islamic world shared their information with each other, which had a big impact on the Renaissance in Europe. The translation and reinterpretation of ancient writings led to a lot of intellectual exchange, which helped pave the way for major cultural and intellectual changes that happened during this time of change. The progress that came after, which led to the Enlightenment and the modern world we live in today, the Renaissance and beyond. The European Renaissance, which began in the 1400s, is often remembered as a time of great intellectual and artistic renewal. The return of classical learning and the arrival of new ideas from Africa and the Islamic world paved the way for a new era of progress and understanding. How Africa affected Renaissance art. Art was one of the most obvious things that changed during this time. During the Renaissance, artists broke away from the strict rules of ancient art and started using a more naturalistic style. Notably, a lot of the colors used in Renaissance art came from North Africa. For example, lapis lazuli and madder root were used to make the deep blues and bright reds. Along with the materials, African patterns and subjects began to show up in European art. Renaissance artists were influenced by African masks, statues, and textiles. This led to the growth of a more diverse and culturally rich body of art. This exchange of cultures can be seen in the famous works of Sandro Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, which were inspired by Islamic and African art. The artistic landscape became more diverse and culturally rich because of these effects. African art styles gave European art a new lease on life. They broke away from the strict rules of the Middle Ages and made way for more realistic depictions. Medicine and science. African culture wasn't just seen in the arts. African and Islamic understanding could also be seen in advances in medicine and science. Avicenna, a Persian scholar who lived during the Islamic Golden Age, had a huge effect on medicine in Europe. The Canon of Medicine, his most important work, was used as a standard medical textbook in European colleges for hundreds of years. Avicenna wrote about many areas of medicine, from pharmacology and healing methods to anatomy and physiology. His work on understanding the vascular system was very important to the growth of Western medicine. Many important discoveries were made in astronomy by African and Islamic experts. These discoveries had a direct effect on how Europeans navigated during the Age of Discovery. Scientists like Al-Battani and Al-Farghani made big steps forward in our knowledge of how celestial things move. European navigators who set out on research trips needed to know this a lot. For long, dangerous trips across the seas, people had to be able to accurately navigate by the stars, navigational techniques. Along with using the stars to find your way, African and Arab understanding also led to the use of certain instruments for navigation. The quadrant and the astrolabe were two of these tools that were very important for making accurate maps of the world and letting Europeans explore. The quadrant, a tool used to find out how high things in the sky are, has its roots in Islamic astronomy. It was created by Islamic experts at first, and then European navigators used it. The quadrant helped sailors correctly find their latitude and location at sea. Another important tracking tool was the astrolabe, which was used to find out how high things in the sky were and to figure out time and star positions. Islamic and African learning had a big impact on how it was used in Europe. Astrolabes were very important for figuring out how the stars moved and for accurately planning trips. Effects of Africa on philosophy and ethics. It's impossible to say enough about how much African and Islamic philosophers have changed European philosophy. Averroes, which is the Latinized name for the Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, was very important in changing the way people in Europe thought. People all over Europe read and admired his comments on Aristotle's works. Averroes' ideas about Aristotle's philosophy, especially about how reason and faith relate to each other, had a big effect on scholasticism in Europe. In a time when the Church had a lot of power over intellectual debate, Averroes' ideas were different from what most people thought and helped bring faith and reason together. This set the stage for the growth of modern Western thought. Averroes had an impact on ethics and the idea of morality. His ideas, along with Aristotle's, shaped conversations in Europe about what is right and wrong and how reason should be used in making moral choices. Some of his writings, like The Incoherence of the Incoherence, helped moral philosophy grow in Europe. As you can see, Egypt and Africa brought a lot to the European Renaissance. They brought art, science, health, navigation, philosophy, and ethics, among other things. This exchange of ideas served as fuel for the Renaissance, which in turn set the stage for the Enlightenment and the modern world. Colonialism and the use of African knowledge. As Europe's power grew, a darker part of history began to play out. From the 15th century on, Europeans began to colonize more and more of Africa in search of resources and money. The African region suffered a lot because of this exploitation. It lost its intellectual and cultural heritage. European colonial powers stole African artifacts and history, leaving the land without any history or art. A lot of valuable things like statues, manuscripts, and artifacts found in the ground were taken to museums and private collections in Europe. For example, the Benin bronzes are still a powerful reminder of how culture was stolen during this time. When colonies were in charge, they often tried to wipe out native information and traditions. Because they thought they were better, European powers took apart and weakened the social and educational systems of African communities. This had a huge and long-lasting effect on the educational and cultural growth of Africa. The process of colonization broke up the transmission of African knowledge and customs. Generations were taken away from their heritage against their will, and many important oral traditions, stories, and pieces of wisdom were lost. African countries are still dealing with the effects of this wrongdoing from the past. In spite of the problems and unfair treatment that colonialism brought to Africa, the continent is making a comeback in the 21st century as its countries become independent and use their cultural and intellectual power on the world stage. People around the world are more than ever appreciating and celebrating what Africa has done for humanity. Between the early and middle of the 20th century, the Pan-African movement grew into a strong force that pushed for African contributions to world culture to be recognized. Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Nnamdi Azikiwe were very important in supporting a sense of African identity and unity, as well as recognizing and honoring the continent's rich cultural history. African writing and art have become famous and praised around the world. Authors like Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie are known all over the world for their great works. All kinds of African art, from old sculptures to new works, can be found in some of the world's best galleries and shows. African philosophers and scholars are making important advances to the field of academia around the world. A lot of important things have been added to philosophy, culture studies, and post-colonial theory by people like Akili Mbembe and Kwame Anthony Appiah. African colleges are becoming more well-known, which helps local knowledge and critical scholarship grow. The African diaspora, which is made up of millions of people who live outside of Africa, has been very important in keeping and spreading African culture and knowledge. African American and Afro-Caribbean groups have made important contributions to music, literature, and the civil rights movement. They have also helped bring attention to Africa's rich history. The fact that Africa had a huge effect on the growth of European culture is a hidden truth that shows how history is linked. Africa has been very important to the growth of the modern world. It was the birthplace of humanity and a place where people traded goods and ideas during the Trans-Saharan trade and the Renaissance. Recognizing this experience is not the same thing as changing the past. By doing this, we can start to make up for the wrongs that were done during the colonial times. It's also a call to celebrate and back Africa's continuing rise in cultural, intellectual, and economic importance on the world stage. As we learn about the complicated past of all people, it is important to acknowledge the contributions of all cultures and civilizations. By doing this, we honor the diversity of our heritage and work toward a more fair and inclusive future where the contributions of all cultures are valued and honored. Africa's part in the growth of Europe is an important part of that story, and it needs to be written down in the annals of history. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos so that more people can see the truth about Black people and hear their own stories. Thank you for watching.